Hello and welcome again. And let's, before we do anything, let's set motivation. Again, looking to think about dedicating our lives to a better cause, developing enlightenment, spreading loving kindness, doing our best to set an example, using these teachings to help develop our minds as much as we possibly can, and considering every second that we have. Thank you. So last week we talked about future lives, and we also finished off death awareness, and we moved on to future lives and rebirth. And I mentioned briefly that we have this thing of recognizing the distinction between future lives and in terms of the religious sense of us actually being reborn personally, but also in terms of the psychological sense of us being reborn from moment to moment, and how the effects, there's a strong and guaranteed consequence of each action having consequences on subsequent actions, and this is both psychological as well as within rebirths. So if we are able to sustain a good mind or a gentle mind, then this is easier and easier for us to sustain from moment to moment. If we lose our mind, we break our mood, then it's harder for us to recover to a stable sense of equanimity or mind. So this is also reflected not just in the moment, but also in terms of life, but not just our lives, also in future lives, other people's lives. So we can see very easily when somebody sets an example, both a negative example or a positive example, then it causes ripples in our world, and people respond to that, and in a sense, seeing somebody else do that enables others, empowers others to follow suit. And this is both positive and negative. So even if we find it hard to accept karma into future lives, we can definitely see how our actions in this world have an ongoing effect, which will affect the future of the world, certainly within our species and possibly beyond that. So we can see, for instance, this rippling effect, this ripple effect of even a single action, a single stone we throw into a pond, and it creates a ripple that itself can establish new, unlike a stone, it can pick up new energy and be reflected and responded and reflected again. And even a single negative action can have a huge, large consequence. And likewise, a single positive action can do that too. So what we can see from this is actually being aware of what is good, what is not good, and sustaining our vigilance on this is absolutely essential for us in terms of our practice, both in this life and also in future lives. So within this, what we're looking at is to say that there are people and there are beings in samsara who have terribly complex and terribly difficult lives, which is what we want to avoid. But not only do we want to avoid that, we also want to be able to use, or if you like, sustain our awareness of the fact that there is suffering in order for us both to feel uncomfortable with or disenchanted by worldly life, and recognize the importance of a spiritual path. And secondly, in terms of the basis of our compassion. So initially, as I said before, course compassion depends upon us recognizing course suffering and feeling empathizing with the pain and suffering of those who are feeling that. In order for us to do that, we must ourselves have some experience of suffering. So it's quite important for us to recognize when we do suffer, not to feel too bad about this sometimes, but also to recognize here's the opportunity for me to develop my empathy, for me to develop my compassion, my loving kindness. And likewise, we begin to recognize that that suffering is one of the driving forces for spiritual practice. So one of the aspects of this within Buddhist context, of course, is as we said before, we have the Buddha recognized and taught. Everybody agrees Buddha taught suffering is the first of the Four Noble Truths. And he didn't do this because he wanted us to be miserable, quite the opposite. He wanted us to recognize the suffering nature of existence such that we can see it within ourselves. We can see that suffering within ourselves, become disenchanted with normal attractions or issues in our lives, and likewise develop this powerful compassion of recognize the suffering of all sentient beings who are not yet liberated, not yet free. So at the time, it was not that he said this, especially in his area. This wasn't something. This wasn't novel. He'd already learned this, and him and his friends who went out into the forest before he became enlightened, they already had recognized suffering as this all-pervasive suffering. And what he did was he recognized it as he recognized the cause of the suffering, and therefore also the elimination and the path to the elimination of suffering. So the suffering nature is the easiest for us to understand. It was a truth that was already determined before Buddha became a Buddha, and it was what motivated him to become a Buddha. Likewise, we see again and again in our texts that suffering is taught such that we can likewise follow suit. So this is the point, not just to make us feel miserable, or we have all these benefits of suffering. And Lama Tsongkhapa talks about this a few times. So last week we finished up talking a little bit about the hell beings and what Narak and what life was like or is like in the hell beings. We also reflected upon how that sort of environment itself can be reflected and seen around us in our world, and we should, unless we've developed an unhealthy fascination with it, we should not turn away from this. There's a tendency to turn away, but what we do need to do is to try to recognize and use that to develop compassion, to feel the discomfort of even seeing somebody in that discomfort, and recognize that is the basis of compassion, it's the basis of altruism, it's the basis of empathy. So we're trying to develop these qualities, and therefore becoming familiar with allowing ourselves to feel those and not run away from it is extremely valuable to us. It's not easy. A lot of this is not easy. This path is not an easy path, but it's a working path. It's a workable path. Facing death head on and saying, yes, I'm going to die, and getting used to the idea and preparing ourselves for death and considering death all the time, thinking about suffering and how the pervasion of suffering and recognizing suffering within ourselves and seeing how it could be used as the basis of compassion. These aren't easy meditations, but they're essential meditations. And that's the point. So Lama Tsongkhapa goes on to say, now we're in chapter 10, he talks about animals and contemplating the suffering of animals. This is one of the shorter sections of the Lam Rim, mainly because he knows that we all have had that experience of seeing animals. And he wants to point out that being born as an animal is not fun. So one of the things about being an animal is primarily that most animals, even apex predators, are fearful. They have fear. But most animals are not apex predators. Most animals are prey, and they are, they have every right to expect to be eaten. You think about a large blue whale, every mouthful of food is hundreds of thousands of animals being eaten. So not only are animals quite rightly fearful of being eaten, most animals are or killed by others. There's also competition even with apex predators where they're trying to see who's going to take over. You have animals which are quite used to the idea of being eaten by their young or eating their young. And continually will be on the edge of concern if they fall ill or they get aged or they have some weakness. That weakness will be exploited very, very quickly indeed. Moreover than that, likewise, we see that deities, human beings, also exploit animals, exploit them for food and also for work. And likewise, in that sense, especially when we look at domesticated animals, they really have no independence whatsoever. In fact, not only do they have no independence, but they've been bred to have no independence. They can't survive. I remember hearing about people who had some sheep and they were sort of let them go. But these domesticated sheep just in the end had to be destroyed by the RSPCA because they were covered in parasites and they had no ability to look after themselves. So this sort of thing is very sad. And the other thing, again, is parasites. Obviously, parasites themselves are animals, but the animals that they dwell on have very, very little control about them. They have no ability really to take them off. The parasites are often buried deeply into the feathers or the skin or the fur of the animals. And the animals have no ability to necessarily get rid of them. So this considerable pain and agitation, itch, and so on is continually there. Even bees, many animals have parasites. And then, there's a poem about the parasites having parasites themselves, and so on ad infinitum. But certainly the life as a parasite isn't particularly good either, in terms of the fact that they are normally, everybody thinks it's okay to kill a parasite, right? So you're destroying, you're creating pain and suffering with no benefit to anyone else. So in this sense, the karma of a parasite is very, very dark indeed. Je Rinpoche says the levels of yogic deeds explains that because they dwell in the same realms as deities and humans, they have no specific special abode of their own. However, and the Treasury of Knowledge auto commentary says that animals range over the land and in the water and the sky. They also say that the primary abode, the primary home is the ocean, Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean too, the ocean, the sea, and all the animals originally came from there and they spread from there. So even though this is written several thousand or over 1,000 years ago, the recognition that the ocean is the source of animal life is recognized there. Garjana, the friendly letter. In rebirth as an animal, there are sufferings, being killed, being bound, being beaten, and so on. They have no peace. They eat each other horrifically. They die because of their pearls. They're killed for their pearls or their fur, their bone, meat, or skin. Many others are put to work by being kicked, hit, whipped, jabbed with an iron hook, or prodded. So the iron hook is referring to elephants, where elephants were generally used, goaded with an iron hook. Eating each other, he says here, is referring to the harm common to all animals. And Je Rinpoche also mentions things like domesticated animals often have noses pierced and so on. And he says that being kicked through to being prodded, it refers to the 5 ways of putting animals to work: horses, buffalo, donkeys, elephants, oxen, and so on, respectively. He then goes on to say that some animals are born in the darkness or in water, where they age and die. Others are continually exhausted by heavy burdens. Many of us have seen that. Some are used for ploughing or shorn for their sheep, like for their wool, or they're chased just for sport. Others are killed after being rendered helpless by various means of slaughter. The slaughterhouses are filled and have been filled since for thousands of years. I remember hearing that there was a slaughterhouse in London where the blood gutter had been kept running for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this shows us that life as an animal isn't particularly fun. And then we should recognize and feel aware of the lack of comfort that animals have. Now we might think, well, actually my pet is very comfortable or seems to be fine, and that's possible. Some animals do have a comfortable life, but they're still on the edge, and it doesn't prevent them from illness. They're still unable to really communicate to their owners. They're not necessarily free. Many animals are kept in even as pets in very, very small enclosed spaces without much freedom. Some cats might have a bit more freedom, but they themselves will fight amongst themselves for territory and so on. So, and they're still subject to disease, and they're subject to this problem, which is while they can sort of communicate a little bit, they have no ability really to sustain narratives. So we can see quite clearly that being unable to tell stories and read or write, have histories, is incredibly limiting in terms of their ability to fend for themselves, and also to establish any sense of identity. So these things are very concerning, really. So that's animals. And then Je Rinpoche moves on to talk about hungry ghosts. So the description in which hungry ghost is given, rather like the hell beings, tends to sort of describe them in terms of human bodies, but they're not really humans; they're non-human. Hungry ghosts are found both on the surface of the world, and they are found in the ground and deep in the ground as well. They can be very intelligent, but they can have tools, but they don't belong in the material realm. In our normal material realm, they belong in a sort of spiritual environment, a sort of non-material environment. Within Buddhism, there are a few different types of creature that don't really have a material existence. As some people see them as actually sharing the same land as us, but they perceive it in a very different way according to their ability. Ghosts, most hungry ghosts are not like what we imagine with white sheets going woo like that. It doesn't work like that. They have a very different type of life, and they are primarily the primary distinguishing feature is they're very hungry. And this, being born as a hungry ghost, normally is caused by being miserly, not being able to let go, gross, very, very heavy, strong attachment. Also, people are obsessive, especially in terms of attachment, coarse attachment, holding on to things. Attachment here, Buddhist attachment's not the same as attachment theory. Attachment theory would probably be called refuge or something like that in Buddhism, but it's not the same as attachment we're talking about here. So coarse attachment, especially those who cases where people are very, very fond of their body, a sort of narcissistic self-love, self-attachment, but also attachment to others that they can't let go. And this can have a very strong effect if they die in this state of upset because they've lost something. So not necessarily just because they lose their life, but maybe at the point of death they realize that they will have to let go, and they become extremely upset, angry. But also, if you have a case where you see something end that you have always expected to be there, and then you can this creates a huge heartbreak, like a broken heart, broken mind, and then you can be reborn a hungry ghost. So one of the things about them is that they are described as hungry, and here it says the skin and the flesh and the blood are desiccated, they're dry, and they have an appearance of burnt logs. I don't know about burnt logs. They have not much in the way of substance. Yeah, they're not really very. They're not like bulky like a burnt log. They're actually almost substanceless, and you could probably fit, many thousands into a single small room. So they have they can squish up into a tiny sort of space. They are not. Some of them have some sort of degree of pride or power, even some sort of power, but most of them are just completely furiously miserable, angry, grasping, and hungry. So they're completely enraged by this hunger that just never goes away. This tearing hunger. There are three types, according to Je Rim Chenmo, three types of those who have external obstacles for obtaining food and drink. So a lot of this is to do with the projection of their mind, or how the way in which their mind is fixated. So there's fixation. One of them is, for instance, they have external obstacles are, for instance, whenever they see something that is available to eat or to drink, as they get closer, either the object dissipates or obstacles appear in their path, such as spears or weapons or animals or beasts that will prevent them from getting there. Or rock falls, or so something always prevents them from getting there. They see it and they grasp after it, but as they get closer, it goes away, a bit like a mirage. So also that sometimes the water might appear to them as being delicious and fresh, and as they get close to it, the river or the pond dries up or turns out to be pus or completely unacceptable. And they lose their interest and remain continually sort of hunting or wandering, trying to find a way through. Then there are those who have internal obstacles for obtaining food and drink, and these, for instance, there are those whose mouths, their hunger is great. Like it's sometimes described as them having bellies the size of mountains. They had so need for hunger, but their mouths are the size of a needle. The eye of a needle is too small, and even when they are able to find food, they can't find any ability to eat it. So they're stuck in terms of being able to eat it. Sometimes they may even have flames coming out of their mouth, which prevents the food from being able to be eaten. As it gets closer, it is burnt or destroyed. So then there are others who have hungry ghosts who have obstacles within the actual food or sustenance itself. And here it said that, for instance, they can't even see food at all, and so they cut themselves to eat that. what they can eat of themselves, and then they cut themselves to eat flesh from their own body, and then they can't eat that either. And then there's a type apparently called possessed, a garland of flames, and whenever they eat it, it bursts into flames, a bit like the worm who have the flames coming out of their mouth. And there are those who are also known as filth eaters, who can eat, but all they can eat is sort of poisonous, stinky, harmful materials, and they are sometimes found eating feces and drinking urine. So and this is a friendly letter again, says that the hungry ghosts never really heal the suffering of destitution. They're destitute, starving, hungry, due to this strong obsessive desire or attachment in previous lives. And he says that this Nagarjuna, they're subject to very fierce suffering produced by hunger, thirst, cold, heat, exhaustion, and fear. And he says also, for these hungry ghosts, in summer the moon is hot, and in the winter the sun is cold. For them, fruit trees are always fruitless, and they merely look at a stream of water and it dries up. So then there's also Chandra Gomin, who wrote in his letter to a student, he talks about hungry ghosts too, how they're tormented by this thirst, and they see a pure stream and they go towards it, and when they arrive it changes into a river filled with broken oyster shells, strands of hair and pus, mixed with maybe blood and excrement. And if they go to a top of they see a cool hill with moist spring breezes and sandalwood trees, and as they go there, they actually experience is a forest fire and no comfort whatsoever. So even if they find themselves on the seashore, they travel to the seashore thinking it'd be nice, and as we would see clear foam and crashing waves, for them it's just like a wasteland blasted by hot sand and a searing wind. So the idea is primarily that, and there's somewhere they talk about here, that they long for rain clouds, and they may even have some magical ability, let's say, for rain clouds to come. And instead, and when the rain comes, it feels like arrows, iron arrows, or burns like cinders, or hits them with boulders. So this has this weird, very strange nature. Hungry ghosts. In one way, they're very, very sensitive, hyper sensitive, and yet also rather strong. So they feel the pain, but they don't die easily at all. They're very furious and not at all happy. There's a lot of fury there, and if there's somebody there who has that they perceive, who is not a ghost, a hungry ghost, then there's often a huge amount of jealousy or anger or deep envy, because they see that this person doesn't have their suffering. So often they have quite ill intent towards humans. If they're able to see humans, some are able to see humans, they have some ill intent. And this is one of the things that makes them quite dangerous. Some can be all right, but mostly not really very much. So in terms of lifespan, he says they can live for many, many years indeed. He sort of talks about 500 ghost years, which each of the days is equivalent to a human month. So the Nagarjuna's a friendly letter says, some beings enduring continuous suffering, bound tightly by the ropes of the karma of wrongdoing of previous lives, do not die, not for 5,000 or even 10,000 of our years. And various things say about their size is that they're not fixed. Their size is not fixed. And all sorts of varieties of hungry ghosts there are in according with karma. So this is really at the end of the discussion of the hungry ghosts. And again, it's like some of this sounds really very difficult to imagine, possibly, or maybe some of us have had some experience with it. But anyway, these things, even if we find it hard to accept spiritual, these sort of non-material beings, we know that there have been plenty of people who've died of starvation and in incredible pain and misery, and have gone and resorted to all sorts of means in order to try to alleviate their hunger and their thirst. So these sorts of things are still happening when they're happening in this world amongst humans anyway. And definitely one of the things we need to be careful of when we're talking about these, especially in terms of karma and the effects of karma, is to think, well, you know, I'm safe. We're not. We all have huge amounts of bad karma from previous lives that is yet to be ripened. What causes the ripening is the circumstances arising for us. So in that sense, we need to be aware of the fact that while we have negative karma, this can be projected into future lives. So Je Rinpoche says, thus when you contemplate these sufferings of the miserable realm, think, you know, at the moment it's difficult really for me to endure sitting even for a single day with my hand thrust into burning coals or onto a stove a day, right? Or to remain naked in a cave of ice or a freezer room, if you like, during the winter winds, or even to go a few days without food and drink. Even when I'm stung by a bee, I don't like it. So if I'm crying or unhappy about being stung by a bee, how on earth can I begin to imagine or bear the sufferings of the hot hells, the cold hells, the animals and the hungry ghosts, where life is just a continual suffering beyond thought. One of the questions that was asked when Geshe was teaching this is, well, if these creatures are in so much, especially the hell beings, are in so much suffering, are they not creating bad karma, and do you not just end up in a cycle where you creating the karma to remain? And the answer to that is to a degree sometimes, but generally the suffering gets so great that there's no ability to do very much than just to suffer. So that is this inaction where one is just in the end feeling so much pain that one can't even be angry or anything, just suffers. So here again, as I said, this is where I disagree, but in a very gentle way. And he says here that we can meditate on this until our minds filled with fear. I don't think this is correct. I think we should never be cultivating fear. Instead, we need to be able to use this to certainly exercise vigilance, awareness, mindfulness, and also recognize and keep a recognition of this empathy, developing this compassionate mind. So we don't want to be fearful. We are working against being fearful. We're working to be joyful. But we need to remember that the causes of this is wrong view and attachment and anger. So causing harm and being or grasping onto things in a negative sense, these are deeply damaging to us, both now and later. So we've got to be keep very aware of and remember and recollect this. The other thing, of course, is that this is core suffering. This is all very, very straightforward core suffering. And being able to reflect on that helps us as we then develop our awareness of suffering to, which comes in a later chapter on all pervasive suffering, which is the basis of samsara. So if we can't see suffering in the animals or the ghosts or the hell realms, we're going to find it very, very difficult to recognize the suffering of normal human life or in the Deva realm, the God realms. So yeah, I mean, at the end, well, what we're going to be doing is working on meditating on the moment-to-moment suffering that we're currently experiencing. So while we are still not so aware of that, we need to begin to exercise our minds about the fact that suffering is there and being able to begin to recognize that. So then Je Rinpoche finishes with a story taken from the Basis of Discipline, Vinaya. And here, this is about Ananda. So Ananda was Buddha's, Gautama Buddha's attendant, chief attendant, main attendant, and he was very, very dutiful to looking after Shakyamuni Buddha. And this story is both shared by Theravada and Buddha and Mahayana. It's not just a Mahayana story. The two Ananda's sister had two sons, and she found them a bit difficult. So they said, we want to become monks, like Uncle Ananda, and so they became monks. And first of all, they were taught to read. But after a while, a short amount of time, when they'd learned to read, they really became lazy and they stopped and they started messing around in the back of the classroom. And Ananda was like, well, okay, this is a bit difficult because they're my nephews. I need to really try to find somebody else to look after these two lazy boys. So he went to Madhgalyana, who's one of the senior or chief disciples of Buddha, and he spent some time with them. And first of all they read, and then very quickly they just stopped and they started messing around at the back of the classroom again. And Ananda then said to Madhgalyana, "You've got to do something about this. They're just wasting their time. They're not doing anything." One could argue possibly he was a little bit feeling a bit responsible as a family member towards them, and he was also possibly a little bit ashamed of them. Anyway, so he wanted, he's saying, "You're the great disciple of Buddha. Hell, to do something about it right now." So a few days later, Madhgalyana took them on a walk, the two boys, and they heard these noises. They had heard these noises of cutting and hacking and other actions of what sounded like sort of thumps and thuds and squeals and so on. And they began to realize that they were, as they came into a clearing where there were these people being hacked and cut and hacked and so on, and animals too were being hacked and hacked up. And this was like a hell realm. So they saw this and they were like, "Ooh." And then as they walked through this, it was pretty disconcerting for them. They saw these two large iron pots filled with water, and the water was boiling. And they said, "Oh." So they said to one of the people who was there, who was like in this abattoir or whatever, said, "Well, you've got two boiling vats of water, or kettles of water out there with fire, and it's boiling away. What do you use that for?" And the person they spoke to said, "Ah, right, yes, that. Well, a good question. You see, Ananda's two nephews, they've become monks and they're wasting their time. And so therefore, because of their laziness, after they die, they're going to be reborn, and we've got one nice pot filled with boiling water for each of them. So I think possibly Marigalyana knew where there was somewhere where he could actually set this up for them. But of course, the tradition is that he made this magically appear. But anyway, it certainly had the effect. They bought into it, and they were absolutely terrified. And they thought, right, we've got to do something about this. I don't want to end up in a boiling pot of water. So they returned, and he said to them, look, you've got to work. If you don't want to be born, if you don't want to be born in a boiling pot of water in the hell rings, you need to do some proper work. Don't waste your time. Don't be messing around in the back of the glove room. Develop your perseverance. And so they did. They began to be persevere and work hard as students. And in fact, for a while, they had slight nightmares about it. And it said that if they remembered this experience before they ate, they lost their appetite. And if they thought about it after eating, then they could even vomit. They could be sick. So this is then another time, a bit later, Marigalyana took them for a different walk, and they had this amazing music. It was like amazing, beautiful music, and they had these incredible smells and sensations. And they came around and they saw this beautiful garden filled with just the most gorgeous young ladies. With very, very, very good looking, and but there were no young men there, and they said, "Oh, where's all the men?" And the ladies came up and they said, "Oh, you're so nice, such a good question." But basically, Ananda's nephews, two of them, they've become monks and they're working so hard. So when they die, they're going to be reborn here, and we're waiting for them. We're so excited. And the two boys were like, "Well, that sounds great." So, he said, "You see, there's some benefit. If you work hard, there's some benefit. You can go to heaven, or if you work, you can do other things. You can use this." So then they were like, started their study, and they got their reading done and so on, and they were much more comfortable with this. And then as they were doing this, they then learned that you can also, even once you've been born in a god realm with these beautiful ladies and everything, then you can also then die and be reborn in the hell realms. And they were like, "Ooh, I don't like the sound of that," So they went to Madhyagalanya again and said, "Oh, teacher, must we also die as a deity or and a human, and then again we can be reborn in the hell realms that we saw?" And he said, "Yeah, until you stop your affliction, you move like a water wheel through the cyclic existence in these realms. So there's no escape." And then they were like, "Well, that's no good." So instead they said, "Oh, we do not even want that. We want to be free of this water wheel, and please teach us." And apparently he taught them, and they became arhats. So they became Sravaka Buddhas from his powerful teaching. So I think Ananda was very happy by that time. So and then Je Rinpoche says, "So therefore meditation on suffering puts an end to our laziness and generates a perseverance towards accomplishing the path. We recognize that it's not something we want to persist in." And he says it's essentially the root of our path is recognizing suffering. And he says, it was praised when the teacher was like Lord Buddha. Of course, it was a very important part of his own instruction and also his own experience. So the passage talked about here is really very much about contemplations of the lower middle scope. But at the same time, he says also, we still need to have this attitude of recognizing, with the great boulder of Sisyphus, we're going up the mountain, that if we don't use our time, if we don't use this time, then we can have very little effect. And if we actually don't constrain or restrain ourselves from negative actions, then we are persisting to create, we're taking part in, we're investing ourselves, even inadvertently, in a negative future. Yeah, and painful. Negative is defined just because it causes suffering. So suffering, we're on a suffering cycle. So we want to try to think carefully about saying, even when we're looking at it within the current world and with the current culture, we need to recognize that doing negative activities, criticizing or taking sides, being sharing gossip, rejoicing in negative activity, taking part in negative activity, stealing, even small amounts of stealing, tiny amounts of stealing, lying, all of these things, killing, obviously, or encouraging others to kill. Anything dark, even the slightest wish that somebody be punished, right? So they should be punished for that. Or saying, oh, they don't deserve that, I deserve that. These emotions, right? Very, very easy, subtly for them to come in, yeah? Negative. So anything like this, it's like saying, oh, it needs to learn something about that. It's no good. If one's intent is to cause harm, that's anger. So with that angry mind, this just leads to angry action. And angry action causes suffering, right? It's the cause of suffering. So both within this life and within our future of the universe, but also within our future lives, we want to avoid doing this sort of thing. If we are able to cultivate virtue and be a little bit better and work a little bit harder on being better, then yeah, we can encourage the world to be a better place. But more than that, what we want to do is to really cut the root of this cycle of trouble. And for that, we need to develop both virtue and also this insight, this understanding, this truth, recognizing the truth of the way in which things are. So he says it's like if you think about saying, being reborn in these low places as an animal or a ghost or in the hell realms, what can you do then? Right? You can't do anything. You can't practice in those situations. It's like having a pounding head. This is Nasupa says this. So if you have had a pounding head, like a really, really bad pounding headache, you can't really meditate very easily. Yeah, it's just too much pain in the head. And likewise, or if you're struggling in a desert just to make it to the next water, your mind is absorbed by your current need. So you're not going to be able to concentrate or really practice very easily. So we have, and this is what he says, is essentially use what we've got, use the moments that we have. And Je Rinpoche says, this is the point. We currently have a good life for developing the path. We have a huge amount of liberty and opportunity. We have the ability to think freely, think for ourselves, to be able to. We have some autonomy, some ability to control what we do. We've got the ability to listen. We've got the ability to teach. We've got the ability to meditate. We've got the ability to practice. Therefore, we actually have a huge amount available to us. And if we use this to clear away our non-virtuous karma, we can help put an end to trouble in the future. This is one thing, it's being able to be fervent in terms of our prayers, and almost sort of ardent in our prayers for avoiding future lives, but it's actions that really make the big difference. Our prayers should be based on saying, I want to do this. I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to change. I'm going to use the moment I have now. And that then makes a huge difference, right? If we do not find the ability to recognize these things, then it's a bit like saying we will not really know how to be able to help ourselves. If we can't help ourselves now, how on earth do we expect ourselves to help ourselves in a future life in these difficult times? So if we are able to develop a positive mind now, when everything is going our way, then even in this life, if we're facing a struggling situation, we will be able to handle it 1,000 times better if we have some practice under our belt, if you like. So once we've got some experience, we are empowered and able to transform this from being a negative, miserable time into possibly a challenging, but certainly an opportunity for us to actually seize it and change it and transform it into something positive and powerful, right? So that's really good. So he finishes the chapter saying, therefore, from Shantideva, Bodhisattva Charivatara, if I neglect to cultivate my virtue, even when I have the fortune to be able to do so, what shall I do when I am confused by the sufferings of the miserable realms? And he says, who will protect me from this great terror? I will stare aghast and search all around for a refuge. Seeing no refuge anywhere, I will become completely dejected. If there is no refuge there, what will I do? Thus, today, I go for refuge to the Buddha, protector of all living beings, the one who strives to rescue all living beings, the mighty one who dispels all fear. Right. So here we have the point, which is, of course, is a bit of a segue into the next chapter. But what he's saying is that the best way for us to respond to suffering is seizing the practice. And the way in which we seize the practice is by finding a reliable source who is able to offer us fearlessness. And this is our safe haven. This is the place, the secure base. This is where we can turn to reliably in our lives. And that is Buddha and the Dharma and the community. So this really is the refuge, is when we are able to recognize the suffering and the dangers of suffering and the fears that can arise from suffering, transform that into an opportunity, because we have this opportunity to say, I want to do something about it. And likewise, if we're able to recognize Buddha Dharma Sangha as a path for us, then we are able to recognize a refuge, a safe refuge, and a reliable refuge for taking ourselves out of samsara. Yeah. So the one of the things we find is lots and lots and lots of people in this world right now have this insight, very, very powerful insight, that life is miserable, suffering. They recognize the emptiness, the insubstantiality of fame and wealth and fortune and all the rest. And it's like nothing. It is not it has no meaning. It has no substance. They're fed up with the commercial world. They're fed up with politics. They're fed up with all of these things. But they do not see a refuge. They do not see anybody who can take them out of that situation, and they become deeply depressed and miserable. And they say, well, what's the point? So the point about it is to say, if we do not recognize a refuge, if we do not think that anybody has an answer that can help us in our path or help us develop a sense of responsibility beyond our own being, then these meditations can be very damaging. And this is why essentially what this sort of mind that rejects or cannot see an opportunity for spiritual practice through recognizing enlightenment, through recognizing Buddhahood. This mind is called a nihilistic mind, and nothing mind. Yeah, and this is very deeply problematic in terms of if you have the very, very strong doubt that that doesn't mean anything, then these meditations can be quite disruptive. So this is one of the reasons why essentially a lot of the time there's importantly is to identify the importance of and the reliability of Buddha. Now, fortunately for us, we do not just have to depend upon texts or revelations for this, but it tells us to use reasoning. So we can use reasoning. He's going to give us some ideas about what we should be considering. This is what like the Lamrim is doing. And we have to make up our own minds about what this means to us and how we can see it actually benefiting us. So in order to, in terms of the way in which the Lam Rim is structured, with the lower scope teachings talking about the three lower realms, Lama Tsong-kha-pa goes on to say that the way to prevent rebirth in the three lower realms is through taking refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha. So we're now on to the chapter 11, which is going for refuge to the three jewels. And we will, we've got about 20 minutes left, so I won't go on. It's quite a large chapter, not that large. So first of all is the cause of going for refuge. And he says there are many, many causes for going for refuge. So going for refuge is in a way is like saying, I recognize Buddha Dhamma Sangha as being reliable and suitable for helping me achieve my goal of enlightenment. And Lama Tsongkha says here, for this purpose, in terms of the way in which we're talking within the Lam Rim, going for refuge is primarily about recognizing the power of karma. Karma is what it is that projects us into a different rebirth, and therefore, and also the environment that we're born into, and the type of body and mind that we're born into. And this karma, therefore, is very important for us to get right. We need to know how to, what good and bad is. We need to know how to express good and bad, and how to manifest good and bad such that we can prevent ourselves from no rebirth. But the other thing is, of course, is that it's important for us in terms of our development as bodhisattvas. And in fact, the primary cause in the Mahayana, which I said is a Mahayana tradition, the Lam Rim is a Mahayana tradition, the primary cause for taking refuge is bodhicitta. Recognizing that refuge is the soul, is an absolutely essential part of the journey to Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. And Shantideva says from Bodhicharyavatara, he says, just as a flash of lightning in a dark cloud momentarily illuminates the darkness of a black night, so too does there infrequently, very occasionally appear in the world by a Buddha's power a few moments of intelligence to cultivate virtue. Thus virtue is always weak and wrongdoing is very powerful. And then Dignaga, another great teacher, says, adrift in the bottomless ocean of cyclic existence, devoured by fierce sea monsters, those known with the name of attachment and the like, to whom shall I go to refuge, for refuge today? So in brief, the causes of our refuge are twofold: fear of the miserable realms, or a wish to avoid the suffering, and our conviction that the three jewels can help us from that. So in a sense, what we're saying is recognizing, we recognize the power of karma, and that following the advice given by Buddha, Dharma Sangha, will help us to transform our karma into good karma. Recognizing karma, being able to follow guidance. So it's not through magical powers, it's through recognizing the authority of Buddha. Buddha said, I'm enlightened. He didn't say I'm enlightened, but he showed his enlightenment. He touched the ground in witness. The witness gesture, where his hand is touching the ground, is one of the ones most common in the statues. And turned the wheel of Dharma, taught the Four Noble Truths and all the other different sutras that are available. So Buddha provided us with a reliable source for our spiritual path. He also said it's available to all of us to do this. He said, in that sense, there's nothing particularly special about me. I just happen to be here. And therefore, he was able to share the path with us, the path to enlightenment. It's not like we are worshipping him or expecting him to give us something, or we have to, that he's God, he's not God. We also don't recognize that there is any ability of a being to control our future lives. There's no judge in Buddhism. So in the end, what affects us is our actions. That's what moves us into our different lives. And those actions have a consequence. So by learning what those actions and how those consequences work, we're able to do something about that. And this is why, as I said, Buddha doesn't give us enlightenment. He shows us the way. If we listen to Buddha and listen to Buddha's advice, then we can do something about it. But he can't do anything without our listening, without us actually accepting and acknowledging that sort of thing. So again, it doesn't matter if we're talking about just ourselves in terms of freeing ourselves from coarse suffering, from all suffering, or all beings from suffering. That all of these are causes for reasons, motivations for us to go for refuge in the three jewels. So based on that, the objects to which to go to refuge, we need to identify those objects. And there's a praise in 150 verses, says, the one in whom no fault can ever exist, the one in whom all qualities always exist. If you are sensible, it is correct to go for refuge to such a person, to praise and honor such a person, and to abide in what they have to say. Therefore, if we can distinguish a refuge from what is not a refuge, it is right to go for refuge to Buddha, the true refuge from a Buddhist context. And although this citation really only refers to Buddha, in fact, is also true that the teaching jewel, the Dharma, and the community jewel, the three jewels, Sangha jewel, are also sort of implicit within that. And Chandrakirti's 70 verses on refuge says, the Buddha, the teaching, and the community are the refuges, or are the refuge for those who desire liberation or enlightenment. So why are they worthy? Why are they valid refuges? Why is Buddha worthy to be a refuge? Firstly, he has mastered himself and attained the sublime state of fearlessness. So one of the things that we're looking to do is to be enlightened, right? And if we are able to see how to be enlightened, if we are free from suffering, we are in a position to be able to teach how to be free from suffering. Therefore, anybody who is fully enlightened is able to teach us a way out of suffering permanently, permanent end to our personal suffering. Moreover, a Mahayana Buddha can teach us how to become a Mahayana practitioner, a Mahayana Buddha who is spontaneously and continually, everlastingly liberating and benefiting all sentient beings, or countless sentient beings, I should say, forever. So secondly, he says, I'm sorry, and he says, this is important. If you've just fallen down, you can't help somebody up while who's fallen down. You need to be able to have stood up. So again, he's an always skilled in the means of training. This is what we're saying. So if he were not so, he would not be able to fulfill our needs. Even if we went to him for refuge and he didn't know how to teach us, then there would be no value. So one of the aspects of this is quite interesting. Is one of the terms used for Buddha is Bodhisattva Buddha, like Shakyamuni, is omniscience, meaning knowing everything. And some different traditions have different ideas about what omniscience really means. And one of them is the Theravadins say that omniscience means that no matter who you are, Buddha knows how to teach you specifically. So this is the most important thing. He knows how to give the path or explain the path to you. So other traditions, like Buddhist Himalayan traditions, tend to be a much more expansive with what omniscience means. But in this sense, the idea is saying, I know how best to meet your needs. Thirdly, he has great compassion. So if he didn't have this great compassion being a universal without exception, without any exception whatsoever, even those who would try to bring infamy or try to destroy his tradition, he always showed pure compassion, right? So even Devadatta, his cousin, who was always attacking him, trying to pull his work to pieces, trying to make his life miserable, Buddha was always consistently compassionate towards him. So if he didn't have this quality, then he wouldn't be in a position to protect us when we went to refuge. So because he'd be arbitrary in terms of his that we couldn't rely upon him as a refuge. Fourth, and this is something I mentioned before again and again, it really importantly is that Buddha is not pleased by material offerings. Yeah, he's pleased by offerings of practice. Just the same within teachers and within the Buddhist tradition, what pleases teachers most is the offering of practice. And again, Je Rinpoche says, if he were not this way, he would again not act as a refuge for everybody, but would only really help those who could give him things. So Je Rinpoche says, in brief, one needs to be free of fears, skilled in the means of freeing others from fear, has a great impartial compassion for everyone, and who acts for everyone's welfare, regardless of whether or not they have given any benefits. And such a person or such a being, if you like, is actually worthy of being a refuge. And we generally recognize that only the Buddha has these qualities, because fearlessness, the true fearlessness, requires us to have a direct, continual perception of the nature of reality, and this is exactly what makes a Buddha. So in that sense, we can say, well, you need to have these qualities in order to be Buddha, and therefore you are eligible for refuge. And Je Rinpoche says the divine creator, so he's talking about a creator God, not necessarily in terms of the monotheistic ideas that we have from Judeo-Christianity, but mainly from the idea of Brahma, for instance, who created, or Vishnu sometimes, who created the universe, doesn't necessarily does not have the ability to offer to remain fearless, is not necessarily skilled in the means of freeing others from fear, is not necessarily has impartial compassion, and so on, and is not necessarily available for us to listen to hear. So then we have these things of saying that essentially, once we recognize that, then we need to trust ourselves to the three jewels with a single pointed focus. So what does that mean? What it means is we rely upon, the refuge means we rely upon Buddha, Dharma, Sangha as our guide. In a sense, we submit to, we entrust our lives and our futures, again, with their guidance. Yeah. And Je Rinpoche says there are two causes for our protection here. There's an internal and an external cause. The teacher, having realized the external factor, provides us with the ability to listen, to be able to be transformed. The internal factor is entrusting ourselves through refuge in terms of his authority, in terms of the authority that Buddha can give. And he says, know that Buddha, moved by great compassion, assists us even if we do not request for help. And Buddha is not lazy. And being unrivaled and auspicious in terms as a refuge abides as our personal protector. Therefore, we could rely upon Buddha for our refuge. What does a refuge? How do we go for refuge? One of them is by recognizing the good qualities, knowing the distinctions through our commitment, and by refusing to acknowledge other refuges. So being specific, choosing our refuge. So I think what I'm going to do is actually call it a day today. So we'll go on to how we go into refuge in 3 weeks' time, I think, because we've got 2 weeks off. It's the end of the first semester. So it's a good place to stop for a moment in terms of refuge. And the refuge, the purpose of refuge, briefly for us, and what we'll be going into more detail, is that we learn what it means to be a refuge to us, and also what follows next is what the precepts of refuge are. So what it means, and one of the benefits of being of taking refuge in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha is that is what, in one sense, what defines us as Buddhists, not Buddhas, Buddhists. We're working on Buddha, yeah. So that's what we're working to. But right now, even if we just take refuge, then we can say we're Buddhists. Another way is to say anybody who recognizes Buddhi, yeah, enlightenment, and sees it as a worthy journey, is a Buddhist, right? Not necessarily religious, because they come from a religious tradition, but a specific religious tradition. But in the narrower sense, then it's like actually recognizing and taking refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha is Buddhist. So a broader one and a narrow one, both good definitions. Yeah. Okay, so let's dedicate any merit. Again, the idea is to dedicate merit in order to seal any positive karma. And I dedicate any merit from today towards my enlightenment, Buddhahood, benefiting everybody I come into contact with, keeping vigilant and mindful of my actions, doing everything I can to make use of every moment given to me that I have available to me. I've worked so hard to achieve. In order that I can continue to benefit and recognize the suffering of and benefit all sentient beings. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for that. And let's finish off with a few minutes of meditation. And I think today either breath or ways, or to consider the suffering of all sentient beings, and developing a sense of determination to make use of our lives to do something that can really help that suffering, to help eliminate that suffering.